We are on the line today with Justin Hendrix. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dylan.
Absolutely. And we got a lot of ground that we can cover, but I'm going to start by us all taking a breath and turning to inspiration. What's something that's particularly inspirational, either in your life or that you're finding in the world right now?
Well, I might point to a lot of what I'm seeing in even my own community in Brooklyn, people trying to take care of each other. Feels like in these kind of difficult moments that neighbors become more important, communities become more important. I hear a lot of people saying that they're trying to invest in knowing the people around them more. And even in my own community, there are a lot of activities to try to organize everything from little stuff like how do we improve the block and have more flowers to how do we make kind of community fridges available to how do we have more little libraries, that type of thing. So I like that people in moments of political difficulty, or what many would regard as moments of political difficulty, are thinking about how to help and how to provide comfort and support to the people closest to them.
I remember in the neighborhood I used to live in Harlem, I never felt more like a community. Like even when moving in, it's just like knowing people in my building, people just wanting to talk to one another. There's just something about that New York community that I miss. Boulder's great. There's a lot of friendly people in Boulder, but it's a little different. Justin, I
Yeah.
wanted to have you on to break down some of the things going on right now in that tech policy world, which is fitting since you run or direct the tech policy press. And I was wondering if we could start with the America's AI Action Plan. Could you just say what that is? For me, it even came, like, I'm in the tech policy space and it came out of nowhere a bit to me. So can you contextualize what this thing is and maybe what some of the history or context is?
Sure. So I suppose it's fair to say the Trump administration kind of came in with a set of priors on AI. They had already, issued a kind of, national strategy on artificial intelligence and an executive order in the first Trump administration. And the Biden administration took its own approach, a very different approach, and focused in particular on, how to address some of the concerns around artificial intelligence. In the campaign, Donald Trump promised that he would reverse what the Biden administration had done, in particular an executive order that Biden had issued. And immediately upon entering office, of course, installed an AI czar and crypto czar in David Sachs, and announced that there would be a plan essentially to formulate a new artificial intelligence strategy. And that involved a handful of things. One, a kind of call for public comment. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy ran a process where I think thousands and thousands of comments were submitted to the White House, including from industry, but also from civil society organizations and many, many, many from individuals. And through some synthesis and some combination of their own policy concerns, the White House has issued last week on July 23rd what it calls Winning the AI Race, America's AI Action Plan. It's a 28-page roadmap, and it came along with 3 executive orders. And I would say that it's fair to say, at least how we characterize it in our reporting on it, that you can think of it as essentially gutting rules and speeding rollout. So the idea is to get regulation out of the way and to really focus the federal government on both the development of infrastructure as well as on speeding the adoption of artificial intelligence.
Can we talk about winning the AI race for a second? That's an interesting framing. What is going on there? Is it just the classic story of we are chasing innovation because it will support the markets and light a fire under the markets to say that you should invest here, or are there other things going on with that story of winning that we should be paying attention to?
Well, a word that is literally in the plan and I think deserves some conversation is the word dominance. because the White House bills the plan as a path to, quote, achieve global dominance in artificial intelligence. And a big part of the plan is really with that in mind. The idea is, of course, we want to, quote unquote, beat China in the AI race, but we want to more or less dominate the planet's use of this technology, and that includes making sure more countries are on an American technology stack. It includes making sure that we have, really the most robust infrastructure when it comes to artificial intelligence, and it also comes to diffusion of the technology across the country. So I think that word dominance is important to really meditate on.
Can you unpack dominance a little bit more here? Because it can mean a lot of different things. I'm thinking about different states close to Colorado. I think it was, I want to say that it was Montana, but over 50% of the expected power grid is going to go towards these new AI data centers. And I'll correct myself in the show notes if Montana is not the correct state. Maybe you can correct me. But there's like a dominance over the market. There's a dominance over the land. There's just different ways that dominance, I think, is working out here. And I was wondering if you could say more about maybe what the administration means or what you interpret that as.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say it truly means American supremacy, both technologically, but also from a kind of owning the ecosystem. And the idea is to get more and more countries essentially into the American tech stack, so that essentially our companies, our AI platforms are the dominant ones. And you see the White House pursuing this in several different ways. One is literally by accompanying the companies on sales calls. So Donald Trump, of course, went to the Middle East recently. He mentioned this in his speech where he announced the AI action plan. He talked about doing deals. He talked about the trillions and trillions of dollars of deals that he anticipates. And, he's essentially stood alongside American tech CEOs in trying to wheel and deal and to ensure that our technology, I suppose, that is produced in the United States is the preferred technology. And then you see the companies also making big investments in what some are calling quote unquote democratic AI. OpenAI in particular is off-selling this idea. They want to make sure more countries are essentially using their technology. They're offering various incentives, ways in which they can partner with governments, ways in which they can even bring capital to bear to drive startup and innovation, ways in which they can try to help countries preserve some of their sovereignty issues alongside, adopting the technology. So think of it as, we want to put American AI in every economy, every government in the world, and we want to dominate that ecosystem.
One of the most frustrating things to me in even going to DC and talking to people about AI and AI such as AI in this plan is that we just throw that term out. Like just, oh, it's AI, right? And even the government, it's like, I'm not convinced that everyone who's using the term in our government in the US knows anything about the technical side of AI or even what those categories are. It's kind of taken on this life of its own. In, say, this plan or in general, when folks like the Trump administration or individuals in the Trump administration are talking about AI, do you have a sense of whether it's like military AI, whether it's just this general topic, or are there specific use cases that people are thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, the plan talks about a lot of different types of applications. It pushes, the idea that we should accelerate the government's own use of AI. That's a big piece of this. There's a lot of conversation among White House officials right now about how to combine data and to allow the federal government to have essentially, access to more information in feeding AI systems. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy Director Michael Kratsios was just talking about that this week. The idea being that we can potentially combine very important data that the federal government has on individuals on through to even things that might seem minor, and make that available for the first time um, with what they believe will, potentially offer more benefit to citizens. So there's a big data and data privacy aspect of this, and a lot of questions about that, about how the government really, for the first time, appears to be combining data sets that have hitherto been kind of kept separate. But yeah, I mean, across the board, health sector, education, and certainly in defense. I mean, you see a lot of focus on thinking about autonomous systems. You see a lot of focus on new forms of research. You see a lot of focus on, as I mentioned, AI in education, and how to implement that. So, this really is broad and cuts across sectors.
So I've skimmed through the report. Is there teeth to this thing? Like, is this all kind of aspirational just to get something out there, or is this is a plan, and you expect, as an outside observer, I guess, as a journalist, you expect this to actually happen and be embodied in some way in policy or in actuality?
Well, I mean, it's important to point out that the plan did come with executive orders, which do direct the federal government to do certain things. You've got an executive order on data centers, especially important to this administration. They want to relax the rules. They want to speed the development of these centers. This is a huge industrial priority. You have the big companies. Even this week, I think we've seen in some of the earnings reports, talking about the risk of not having enough compute and the speed at which they're going to be able to develop the necessary data center infrastructure. So that's a big concern. And you do see, the executive order, making various efforts along that way to ease permitting, bypass environmental reviews, make available federal lands. So those things will happen. Another one, countering China on the global stage. I mean, this is an important piece as well. This idea of promoting the export of the American AI technology stack, which we've just discussed. There have been some changes to the way that the government wants to approach things like controls on chips and that approach. And so, I think all of that's important. The other thing that I'd point out is this executive order on woke AI, which essentially is a kind of edict intended to kind of erase what the administration regards as ideological bias in artificial intelligence systems. We've had multiple contributors on Tech Policy Press that have pointed out this particular order is a bit insidious and in many ways does exactly what it says it's countering, which is that it kind of creates an ideological bias in fact. The other parts of the plan that call on federal agencies to do certain things. I mean, there's mention, of course, of the Federal Trade Commission. The plan essentially calls on the FTC to relax its posture on policing AI. There's some talk of the Federal Communications Commission and what it should do. So, there's quite a lot going on here. Another piece of it, we just saw this AI moratorium that coursed through Congress in the budget reconciliation process. And, the idea there was we'll create a moratorium on state level regulation of artificial intelligence. That did not succeed in the budget reconciliation. It was essentially struck out at the last minute in a Senate vote, 99-1, to remove it from the final text of the reconciliation package. But I think it's fair to say the AI action plan is kind of moratorium light. It's suggesting that the states, will be evaluated on their kind of, environment around AI regulation, and that could in fact have some implication for the types of, willingness of the federal government to engage with those states on AI. So, not quite a moratorium, but a kind of moratorium light.
One thing that surprised me about the act was I don't disagree with all of it. But then I come into contact with something like the woke AI executive order, and I'm like, really my thought was, this is dumb, but also this can be really harmful, I think. One thing that I can't make sense of, though, is this administration moving towards a top-down we need to control what the states do as a government around AI versus more, no, it's in the state's hands. Like you go deal with it and we're just going to deregulate. Can you unpack that or disentangle some of that state government top down versus state top up?
Yeah, I regard this as very top down. This is the federal government essentially saying this is the most important, or one of the most important strategic issues that the country faces. It's important for the economy. It's important for defense and our kind of geopolitical situation or circumstances. And it really will dominate in many ways the century and the extent to which the United States may maintain whatever advantage it has in the world. So very much this is the federal government taking the reins and saying, we can't allow a conversation, at lower levels of government to impede the national objective, and that objective is dominance. And so, I think you'll see more of that, and there'll be questions, I think. We've already had questions raised in contributions on Tech Policy Press about some of the constitutionality of these things, of the degree to which federal agencies that may be tasked with going ahead and using their enforcement authorities in certain ways, the degree to which the public will have input on that. So there are a lot of questions here that will only play out over the next few months and years.
I want to get back to privacy in a second, but while we're having this conversation, I'm thinking of you as an editor for pieces that are covering very emerging but also politically sensitive topics within the AI space. I'm wondering for you how you think about what opinions and what voices to lift up in this conversation and how you walk that line as a journalist of how to cover topics like this.
Yeah, we have a couple of things going on at Tech Policy Press, and we host a lot of contributions from outside contributors who essentially are volunteers. They come from civil society, they come from different groups that focus on tech policy. In many cases, they're academics and researchers who cover these issues. So that's kind of one piece. Another piece is our own reporting and analysis and what we produce there. And we do kind of keep those things a bit separate in our minds, in terms of what we're trying to do and what we will accommodate from outside contributors. And in general, we're a heterogeneous, nonpartisan site. We accept perspectives from various places. We're always skeptical, generally, of where those perspectives are coming from. I think as a site, if you were to kind of assess us, what are we about, I think you would probably agree with the assessment that we are skeptical of corporate power, also skeptical of government power, and very skeptical of the combination of the two. And so for me, those are important things to kind of keep in mind. That doesn't mean that every corporate perspective is, verboten, or that we don't, take into consideration ideas that may be pro-industry in certain circumstances or in certain layers. But in general, I think the balance of the contributions on our site and more or less the analysis are to essentially concern themselves with power and really to kind of query it.
That's a great segue back into privacy on this and the intersection between, say, this AI Act and corporations and companies. So on one hand, I am hearing this deregulation lets open up, let companies kind of do their own thing, and that, again, will stimulate the market, all this other stuff. And on the other hand, I'm hearing, well, also, those companies should be collecting data about users. Also, there seems to be this desire to clamp down on certain areas of privacy. Again, I was wondering just how you make sense of privacy within this corporate relationship that the government seems to be having right now.
I think for that, you have to step back and you have to kind of look at the broader situation in the U.S. Unlike most developed democracies, we do not have a comprehensive policy on privacy or legislation on privacy. The states have made some progress, I've talked to many privacy experts, many of whom would say that the state laws that are in place are simply not up to snuff for the moment that we're in, and for multiple reasons. In some cases, because of the protections they fail to provide, but another reason is because they simply don't have the kind of enforcement teeth that might come from something at the federal level. So we're already kind of starting on the back foot in this country. When the AI revolution is upon us, we don't have one of the basics in place. And that is unfortunate, I think, and something that I don't see necessarily resolving anytime soon. We just had a piece this week on Tech Policy Press from a gentleman called Robert Gelman that kind of looked at the history of privacy legislation in the U.S. and asked the question, is a comprehensive legislation possible? And I think it's fair to characterize him as saying, he's not holding his breath. He's hopeful that perhaps something will bubble up from the states. I just talked as well to Daniel Asalov, who's a privacy expert, just has a new book out on privacy and technology, literally called, I think, Privacy and Technology, or on Privacy and Technology. And, his kind of contention is that, when it comes to thinking about privacy in this technological age, that the law is the villain. We simply don't have the laws in place that we need. And he goes on to kind of take that apart and talk about a lot of assumptions and a lot of circumstances that have created that. But I would go further by saying simply that it's clear that the industry has, in many ways, essentially, stood against privacy legislation, privacy regulation, have sought hard to get what they want in the states, and have used a playbook that we've seen other industries do in past to avoid regulation. And so, that's a real area of concern, and not one I see, unfortunately, being resolved anytime soon.
What would it take for it to be resolved? The word resolved, I know, is also like, what is that? What does the solution here look like? But yeah, what would it take to get some energy behind this? Do you think that does it need to be at the federal level, or are there other ways that this can begin changing?
Eventually, I think we do need a federal standard. I think most folks would agree on that. But, what would it take? I mean, I think there's a bunch of things you have to overcome. One is that there is simply a lot of, I don't know what the right word is at the moment, kind of pessimism or kind of fait accompli or just assumption that privacy is quote unquote dead, that the cat's out of the bag, that the companies already have all of the information, that there's no putting the thumb back in the dike, whatever metaphor you might want to use. That is a sentiment that I think a lot of folks hold. And even just if you talk to lay people about these issues, there's often that thought of like, well, what can I do? So I think overcoming that is one thing, that's going to be difficult, and creating that political will ultimately for that. But in Congress and in the federal government in general, there's a set of kind of, I guess, opposite incentives, which is, more data in order to govern, more data in order to surveil and make perhaps what some would regard as a safer society, more data to power artificial intelligence systems, which are crucial to our quote-unquote dominance, all of those things. So, it's going to be a difficult road ahead. It's possible at some point there could be another kind of catalyzing moment. I think many people thought a few years ago, and it now is quite some time ago, that an event like the kind of Cambridge Analytica scandal, for instance, which did provoke an enormous amount of activity in legislatures, including hearings in the United States, but many, many, many investigations and even played into legislative processes elsewhere in the world. That was a catalyzing moment, or moment that many people looked up and said, "What are we doing here?" I suspect there may be another moment like that. and I don't know where it'll come from. I'm not, able to tell you which company will get caught out or what particularly will happen. But I think that we may end up with one or more of those types of moments in the next few years as artificial intelligence gets more broadly diffused.
You mentioned surveillance, which is something that today, this is Thursday, July 31st, that I'm thinking a lot about. There's a lot of news coming out about YouTube in particular, age verifying in different countries. There's also been talk in the US and using AI ML to look at accounts saying like you're under the age of X, like you're under the age of 18. In maybe the AI Act, you can take this wherever you want, but as you're thinking about surveillance right now in tech policy, where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, age verification is kind of a specific kind of concern underneath the privacy and surveillance concerns, I suppose. Across the U.S. and in states and across the world in different jurisdictions, there have basically been laws put in place that require age verification in different ways. In the U.S., there's been a big focus on access to pornography and kind of other considerations. Some of the states are concerned generally about access to social media and the potential, problems that might pose for young people. And then, elsewhere in the world, I think there's been some recent movement, for instance, in terms of the actual implementation in the United Kingdom. This does seem to be where things are headed. There's still an argument being had essentially in the tech industry over who is best to do age verification, whether it's at the kind of application level or at the device level, or perhaps somewhere in between. And I don't know exactly where we'll end up on in the next few years in terms of what the broadly accepted standard will be. But it is a very active area in the U.S. I know I'm about to go to the National Conference of State Legislatures next week, which is this annual conference where state legislators get together from all over the country. They're an interesting group of people, and they talk about various issues, every type of policy issue, but there's a track on tech, and concerns about child safety have been present in the agenda for that event for the last few years, and will be there again this year. And so it's an ongoing discussion, exactly how this should work.
Yeah, I pulled up your piece because I really like this one. It was called Considering the Human Rights Impacts of LLM Content Moderation, which is slightly connected to this topic of content moderation and who can access what content and when. I was wondering, because I haven't heard that content moderation plus human rights combined before, which was really compelling to me, how you're thinking about human rights and content moderation in general, maybe in terms of security and privacy that we're talking about right now, but how are those two things connected?
Well, I mean, I think, at least from my perspective, kind of human rights considerations are primary. And, so everything that we do to think about safety and we think about things like privacy, have to go through a human rights lens. And there's a lot of work, as you mentioned right now, in thinking about new versions of content moderation mechanisms, and age verification, of course. I mean, the big question is around free expression, free speech, and access to information, the ability to express oneself, the extent to which these systems essentially become a form of surveillance, requiring people to part with information or share information with the government or give the government the ability to discern what types of content they're looking at or what have you. All those considerations are there. The content moderation in LLMs is almost a kind of, I think of it as a slightly separate thing, but it's another thing that's happening where companies are looking at their apparatus for managing huge amounts of user-generated content and other content that's coming across their platforms. And they're saying, well, how do we deal with this? And increasingly, for many, the answer is with AI. It's with large language model based systems that are interacting with people at the point at which they may post something or prior to it even, which is something quite different from past content moderation regimes. And so, that's another place where we're seeing this kind of blurring of the line between technical systems and, user speech on the other hand. So a lot of huge questions there, and, ones that we try to explore on Tech Policy Press because there are no really easy answers.
The YouTube case study is interesting to me, and this is in terms of what you were talking about in free speech, where on one hand there is this push towards more age verification and restricting who can access what content when, and maybe for child safety that's a good reason. Maybe there are other more negative reasons, like privacy and data collection about users, connecting people's pictures to other data about them. But then on the other side, YouTube is making this move towards allowing less censorship of language, which has been really interesting to trace, where people are going to be censored less in terms of being demonetized for using certain language. And for me, at that tension, there's this bigger conversation about free speech and what free speech means in our current, I guess, content moderation climate or beyond. I was just wondering how you think about free speech right now in AI and tech policy. It's a really large question, and there's no there's no good answer. I'm really just throwing you up to the wolves, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, okay, so I think for this one, what I would say is, in some ways, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm kind of pushing the question back on you, but in many ways, this is one of the kind of primary underlying issues in all of tech policy. When we're dealing with a lot of tech policy, we're essentially dealing with forms of human expression and questions about the extent to which various poles of power should have control or input over forms of human expression. And so, to me, that is the kind of governing question in a lot of these debates. It's how do we find an equilibrium somehow between the protection of people, protection of people's collective interests, versus protection of people's individual rights and interests in free expression. And I don't think anywhere in the world has a perfect equilibrium been found. I think in the U.S. We're out of equilibrium in one particular way, which is that there's a kind of free speech maximalism that's at play here. It's certainly been adopted by many of the tech CEOs, people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, and that is, of course, the kind of governing set of ideas in the federal government as well. And again, I think we have to distinguish between what these people mean by free speech and censorship versus what perhaps those terms might actually mean in some cases, and there's a real set of open questions there.
Maybe under the umbrella of the free speech conversation or beyond, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, is there a piece that you've written recently or a story that you've come in contact with that you found was really compelling, or just came up with a moment of clarity of oh, this is either this is why I do this work, or oh, this is what the world is like right now?
Well, if on this particular topic, I would actually point to some of the things that we've had from Marianne Franks, who kind of studies this issue and is a scholar who's written about the First Amendment, and I think that's one in particular that would be worth looking at. We just had a piece just the other day, and I'll try to pull up the title of it while we talk. But we have multiple pieces that kind of get at this question of free speech and kind of the what I'm describing, which is this kind of problem of equilibrium, and we're kind of constantly coming back to that and constantly trying to kind of plumb that in different ways. We just recently had what I think of as a kind of great piece by a man called David McNeil, who's a philosopher and kind of a scholar, in particular of European philosophy. He wrote a piece for us called Rethinking Speech Rights in the Era of Corporate Information Control, which I might direct your listeners to check out, where he makes a handful of arguments, but in particular, kind of thinking through some of the issues around how free speech and kind of fundamental rights have been considered in the United States. And his argument essentially is that we need to return to a more kind of democratic conception of the constitutional right to free speech, that he, along with other scholars, believes we've kind of got away from. The jurisprudence around the First Amendment, in some cases, other aspects of the Constitution or legal precedent, that we've moved away from some of the original intent. So I would push people to look at things like that on Tech Policy Press, and there's a whole world of scholarship that people can go into on those questions.
This is maybe a tangent, but what do you think is the role of like different disciplines like philosophy in this policy space? I feel like there is a philosophy underpinning, even this a political philosophy underpinning a lot of the decisions being made, but I don't think we often bring in philosophers into the policy conversation. Maybe I'm biased, but maybe as much as we should. And I was wondering for you, as you're curating or as you're thinking about bringing different voices in, how do you think about philosophy or some of those non-policy, big P policy discussions?
Yeah, that's interesting. We actually talk about that internally sometimes, about wanting to make sure we leave room for ideas that are what I think of as upstream of policy, and certainly philosophy and other disciplines are upstream of the kind of political and legal debates that might be happening a little closer to legislatures or regulatory bodies or even the public debate. And to me, that's really important, because some of the things that we're addressing right now, we really are fighting over fundamentals, which is one of the reasons I think tech policy is so interesting. It's one of the reasons I think it's a space to work in, because it feels like when we're talking about technology, what are we really talking about? We're often talking about what the rules should be, about how we interact with one another, with government, with corporations, with various sectors, or maybe even a better way to think about it, with various human endeavors and things we do in our lives. And a lot of it is contested. How should these things work? What would be the ideal state? What are we working towards? What future are we trying to build? And so, very quickly when you're making tech policy decisions, you are asking philosophical questions in many cases. And right now, I think there's a very robust conversation in tech circles about, the future that many would like to build, the future they would like for the human race, the future they would like for the planet. And if you're not open to those types of questions, I think you can't really have a policy discussion.
I was talking with a woman, an undergraduate student, yesterday, actually, and she's someone who's going to join the AI for All Tomorrow's team. Maybe, listeners, you'll hear her on the show at some point. But she was talking about the distinction. She was basically struggling with how to think about effective altruism compared to utilitarianism in tech and tech policy. And I thought it was like, wow, I wish there were more people who were asking these kind of questions. Like, I wish when I went to DC, these were some more of the questions that I was hearing in more different spaces. Do you have a sense of how to engender those conversations more? Obviously, you have a platform in which you're doing a wonderful job of that, but maybe for listeners, maybe for undergraduate listeners, because I know we have a fair amount of those, What would you say?
Well, this is a question that we have also grappled with. How do you bring these things in? We recently had a series of posts from different contributors that were organized by Data and Society, the nonprofit organization, and it kind of implicitly, or actually I should say explicitly, had this goal, which was to kind of look at some of the ideas that underlie some of the kind of tech rhetoric, and some of the rhetoric coming out of the government, the federal government, U.S., for instance, and to kind of unpack them, to look at the influences, to look at the ideas. We've had a couple of pieces lately that get into some of the things that you're mentioning. around some of the more fundamental kind of ambitions around pronatalism, for instance, or some of these ideas around digital eugenics, or some of the other kinds of conceptions of what the future of humanity should look like, or what the planet should look like. I think one of the struggles with bringing that stuff into policy debates is that a lot of it seems really weird. Frankly, and in order to follow some of it, it feels like you have to kind of get the red yarn out and connect different ideas and people and groups, etc. But the reality is that when you get the yarn out and you start to do the connections, it really truly does lead to some of the most powerful people on the planet. That some of these ideas, if not fully held by individuals like an Elon Musk or a J.D. Vance or others, are at least influencing their thinking. They're swimming in the same orbit as, or swimming in the same water, I suppose, or in the same orbit as some of these thinkers and individuals. You mentioned effective altruism, for instance. So I think that's one of the key things, is like how to bring those things in a way that people can understand the connections between the types of policy and maybe even corporate developments that they're seeing, and some of these ideas that may seem fringe if you just look at them by themselves. They seem very odd, and yet they are part of the kind of governing politics.
We've talked a bit about people visioning a future that they want to see. And while I had you on the line, I was wondering, is there a future of tech or tech policy that you want to see?
We have a fellow right now called Nika Collier-Navaroli, who's doing a series of podcasts for us, which she's calling Through to Thriving. And more or less, it's trying to kind of get past the current moment and sort of think about how we even think about the future. How do we engage in imagining, and how do we find joy? How do we try to adopt more positive visions? One of the reasons I'm excited about that project and other projects like it, there's something similar that the Distributed AI Research Institute is doing, where they're trying to essentially make room for different futures. I just heard Dr. Alondra Nelson on a podcast with Ethan Zuckerman just yesterday. I was listening to this, and she was talking about the need to really invest in alternative futures. I'm excited about all of that type of thinking because I think we desperately need it right now. You are in a situation where billions and billions and billions of dollars are being spent to advance, I think, a fairly singular vision of the future by an industry. That future has more or less been adopted, or you could say maybe co-opted by governments, and really there's very little on sale as far as alternative futures that can compete, that has the type of salience that those ideas have. And so I'm very excited about any project that essentially kind of tries to challenge the dominance of that particular version of the future. And what do I mean specifically? I mean, more Afrofuturism, more Chicano futurism, more Desi futurism, more every type of futurism that isn't Silicon Valley inflected futurism. We need different images in our minds of what the world can look like and what role technology can play in that world. And I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb by saying that democracy is in an extraordinary crisis, both in the United States, where it is on the verge of being lost, and elsewhere in the world, where we've had now almost 2 decades of democratic decline. So we need democratic visions of the future, small d democratic visions of the future. And I don't know that is what Silicon Valley is selling us right now. So hopefully your listeners will go out and maybe seek out some of those resources. They'll read widely and try to make some room in their own minds for different types of ideas about where we could go.
That's where this project came from. So this is a great also plug and maybe some areas for collaboration in the future, because I love what you all are doing, especially what your fellow is up to, because we were seeing one tomorrow, what I was calling one tomorrow of this is the Silicon Valley narrative. It's like, well, what if there is more than that? Or at the very least, what if we can like speculate more of that if we get more voices in the room? So thank you for being a voice in the room with us for this episode. And as we move towards closing, is there a piece of media, book, movie, music that you would recommend to listeners?
Can I think about this one for just 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of options. And it can be more fun, or it can be within line in the conversation.
Yeah, I had a couple of things in mind earlier, and unfortunately, they sort of like flew right out of my head when you finally asked the question. A book, a movie, or two. So I'm going to give you, I think, a book. Actually, I'll make this easy. I'll just kind of connect it to this. There have been a lot of books written recently about some of these issues that we've talked about around artificial intelligence and power in particular. I would recommend very much Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI. I think that book is one of the best written. It's in many ways, let me get that correct. Let me get the title of it correct, because I want to make sure I
always
give you
forget
the full
the subtitle.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I'm going to cut this part out because we're still confirming a time. Karen's schedule is so crazy. Hopefully we'll have Karen on the show. I've interviewed her before. She's amazing. She's just an amazing person.
Yeah. So I'll kind of start again, but I would recommend Karen Howe's new book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. It's a fantastic book. It's one of the best out there on artificial intelligence, I think, at the moment. It's both a kind of history and an analysis of where that company came from, how it's been led, and I think paints a picture of where things are headed. If folks listening to this, if there's kind of any curiosity around where things might be going with regard to artificial intelligence, this idea of supremacy or empire, how that connects with the kind of corporate and political interests around artificial intelligence at the moment. This book lays out a lot of details, so I really would truly recommend it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great book. it's really good. If you haven't read it, please do read it. Justin, for the different links and articles that we've mentioned in the show, of course, we will add those to the show notes so that people can follow up. Are there other ways that listeners could either support you or find out more about you and the work you're doing?
I would recommend people sign up for our newsletter if you want to keep up with us. You can find it at techpolicy.press. Of course, we have our own podcast, and you're welcome to listen to that as well. And if you want more, of course, every day on the site, we're posting somewhere between 3 and 5 fresh pieces of material, sometimes reporting, sometimes analysis, sometimes perspective. But you can find all that at techpolicy.press.
Justin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dylan.